It's Friday, October 25th, 2024, and we are 10 days away from the election. Welcome to Make It Make Sense. I'm Grant Herms. Today on the show, we are talking about the legal fights already underway across the country surrounding the election and what that means that we should expect after the election. And I talk with legal expert, columnist, podcaster, and YouTuber Liz Dye all about it. But first, let's get to your headlines. On Monday, the Biden White House announced it would be proposing new rules that would force insurance companies to cover over-the-counter birth control. Now, that rule would work through the Affordable Care Act and would include a range of things like emergency contraception, a brand new over-the-counter birth control pill, and even condoms. The ACA does say that most insurers have to cover birth control without copays, but it only applies to prescriptions, mostly because when the law was written back in 2010, an over-the-counter birth control pill just didn't exist. Polling across the country shows a large majority, and a bipartisan one at that, for better access to contraception and birth control, so this is likely going to be a popular move, but it's just a proposal right now, and it could end up in front of the Supreme Court, where the most conservative justices have argued that access to birth control should be limited. On Wednesday, Boeing workers who went on strike nearly a month and a half ago rejected the latest proposal from Boeing extending the strike. So the workers who walked off the job are machinists, so the people who actually put the planes together. Now, they're asking for a 40% wage increase over the next 4 years, and 2/3 turned down this latest offer that was a 35% increase. The strike has been extremely costly for Boeing to the tune of about $1 billion a day in a year where the company has been marred by scandal after scandal, from everything from doors and wheels falling off of planes to rumors of a corporate cover-up to stranding 2 astronauts in space. So far, there is no end in sight to this strike, but the Biden administration is now involved and has offered to help talks continue to move this strike along. On Thursday, it marked 1 year since world leaders made a history-setting agreement to move away from fossil fuels to slow the impact of climate change, and according to a brand new report that also came out on Thursday from the United Nations, the world didn't make any progress. In the last year, the amount of greenhouse gases in the air hit record levels and show no signs of slowing down much or at all in the next 10 years, which is how far out these studies look. Now, those numbers also mean that the countries of the world are going to break their promise to lower carbon emissions that they made back in 2015 when they all met to sign the Paris Climate Accords. Now, the report came out just a few days before UN leaders are supposed to be meeting in Azerbaijan for the UN Climate Change Summit to address, presumably, climate change. Though, given this latest report, expectations for how that's going to go are not high. And finally, tonight is Game 1 of the World Series between the New York Yankees and the LA Dodgers. The Dodgers beat the New York Mets in the National League Series, ending hopes of what was dubbed a Subway Series between the Yankees and the Mets that would have taken place in New York only, basically. But the Yankees and the Dodgers are two of the most storied and historic teams in baseball, for which a fan like me without a dog in this fight is just going to be a lot of fun to watch. Now, those two teams have met in the World Series 12 times before over the course of their long histories, and right now, the Yankees are favored to win, which would give them a record 28 World Series wins. The first pitch is at 8 o'clock tonight at Dodger Stadium in LA. Okay, those are your headlines. Let's get to today's main topic, the election in the courtroom. I've talked before about the ways that specifically Republicans are already undermining confidence in the 2024 election through rhetoric and denial and lawsuits, but today I want to focus on the courts because the other stuff is just talk. Sure, it's effective talk, but it won't matter once votes are cast. Not really. What will matter is what happens in courtrooms across the country. Right now, there are 165 lawsuits in states all over the place, mostly in the 7 swing states. That's Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Georgia, Arizona, and Nevada. And a majority of them have been filed by Republicans. And they've been piling up fast and late in this race. According to Bloomberg, which did an exhaustive study of all of these cases, more than a third of them were filed in August or September, well within what's known as the 90-day window, which under federal law bars states from making changes to voting laws and procedures. And just this past spring, the official National Republican Committee, so the official Republican Party, said their slew of suits is an unprecedented legal strategy that they say is aimed at election integrity. And I've talked about this before. There's no evidence that the integrity of our elections is bad or realistically at risk, so these lawsuits just kind of gum up the works. But let's talk about how. So these cases split into a few issues: state voting records, so essentially who gets to vote, how voters cast their votes, and how elections get finalized, or what's known in the biz as certified. Most of them are happening in that first batch of issues, the voting records. Those are mostly surrounding things like voter eligibility challenges, so they want to make the list of people who can vote in certain states smaller. That is what's in the majority of Republican lawsuits filed in these swing states. How those work is they accuse a state's election official or officials of having not, quote, cleaned up the voter rolls, which just means removing people who have died or moved from the state's voter lists. And states are very good at this, and sometimes these are cases of people just not understanding how election processes work or how doing this to the voter rolls works. Oftentimes in these elections, they know that what they're filing in these courts isn't going to amount to anything, but they do it anyway to make election workers scramble to, in a sense, undermine the election before it gets started. One of the most recent cases was from the RNC. It was just thrown out by a federal judge in Michigan, and it accused the state of having more voters on the books than people who were eligible to vote. Now, the claim wasn't remotely true, with the judge saying that Republican lawyers didn't find a single actual case of a voter who was registered but wasn't eligible. However, it gained a lot of traction in conservative circles, and there are dozens of those cases filed in each of these swing states. In North Carolina, a lawsuit was filed against the University of North Carolina that was going to allow students and faculty to use digital IDs as proof of ID. An appeals court there overruled that, making thousands of students and staff ineligible to vote in a key county of a key swing state that, had they been able to vote, would likely have benefited Democrats. Now, those students and staff can still use physical ID cards, although most of them, when they became a part of the university, opted not to do that because a lot of people just don't do that anymore, and so they've had to scramble to find ways to get these physical cards. Now, I'm pulling this from an article in the Daily Tar Heel, which their slogan is printing the news, raising hell since 1893, which is just awesome. Anyway, the thing about these cases is that so many of them have been in the court systems since this summer or this spring, and a lot of them aren't going to be finished by Election Day, which means whatever happens with them could end up impacting the election or how people feel about it on the back end of voting. On the Democratic side of these things, because there are cases that have been brought by Democrats, they tend to be brought in mostly Republican states that have purged voters from their active voter lists, those voter rolls, like in Alabama, where the state just summarily removed thousands of people from the voter rolls, saying they were foreign nationals because they lined up with certain names on a list of foreign nationals, though many of them weren't, and many of them were eligible to vote who had become naturalized citizens. A federal judge in that case told Alabama last week to stop its voter purge, and the Department of Justice has now sued the state over it because it violates that federal 90-day voting law. Then there are the cases about how people actually vote, the things like absentee voting or drop-off boxes, and let's start with those. The big case in drop-off boxes was in Wisconsin, where after the 2020 election, lies about people stuffing ballot boxes or tampering with them or just misunderstanding how they actually worked led the state's conservative Supreme Court to ban them from the state, only for the incoming liberal judges on the court who were elected in a major election in 2022 to overturn that ruling in 2023, leaving whether ballot boxes can be used up to individual county officials. Now, ballot boxes are incredibly safe and in Wisconsin had been used for years without issue or controversy until it was politically useful for Trump and his campaign in 2020 to create this controversy. Some of the biggest lawsuits out there have been about absentee or mail-in ballots, which I've talked about before, but these ones are especially about the overseas ballots from Americans living abroad, members of the U.S. Civil Service, and members of the military. Now, those lawsuits, again brought by the RNC, argue that absentee ballots, which are incredibly secure, should be set aside and not counted until a voter's eligibility can be looked at. Except to get an absentee ballot sent to you while you're living abroad, you already have to be found eligible. You already have to go through the process of signing up to get that ballot. So, 2 of those lawsuits in Michigan and North Carolina have already been shot down, but like the others, they serve to undermine confidence in those votes. And in states like Nevada and Mississippi, there are Republican-brought cases about the state's laws surrounding when a mailed ballot can still count if it comes in after the polls close. A majority of the states across the country say as long as votes are postmarked by Election Day, they can still be counted, but these lawsuits are seeking to have them not be counted. So, after all of that, we get to the cases that deal with what happens after the election. In Pennsylvania, there are lawsuits right now about whether someone should be allowed to be contacted by their local election clerk to fix an issue with their ballot, like their signature, which is called curing your ballot, and how many days after an election someone should be allowed to be able to do that. Usually, it's about 2 to 3 days in most states across the country, although that depends on your state, so if you're worried about your absentee ballot, you should double-check that. But this lawsuit in Pennsylvania wants to make that process more difficult. And finally, there are cases that want to give election officials the power to decide whether they can finalize or certify the election results at all. The biggest case is in Georgia, where just this week, the state Supreme Court ruled the election workers had to certify the results no matter what, according to state law. And that is all the major kinds of cases here. And it's important to talk about the difference between all of these things I just told you about compared to what happened in 2020. For starters, there are 2.5 times more cases now than there were back then, and those were filed after Election Day. There were also mainly things challenging the way votes were counted and who could make election results final. None of these things really happening on the front end by trying to put votes in separate piles and just have them not be counted. This time around, things are much more proactive, and that's why so many people are watching what's happening in the courts, because it could serve to undermine voting before it even starts. And it's a big worry for my guest today. Liz Dye is the host of the Law and Chaos podcast. She's the writer on the Law and Chaos Substack and newsletter. She's a columnist in the outlets Above the Law and Public Notice, and if that's not enough, you can see her on the massively popular Legal Eagle YouTube channel. Now, she found some time in between all of that to come and talk to me about how she is watching this election shape up in the courts. Let's start at the beginning then and talk about what's happening right now, which listeners will have just heard. 160 plus lawsuits happening. What are the ones that you're watching that are the most concerning to you?
Well, let's talk about what is happening, and then we could talk about what I think are really placeholder lawsuits for in case the election is very close and Harris is winning, right? So you have a lot of lawsuits now that are sort of garbage lawsuits, like challenges to ballot boxes and challenges to, signature matching and security envelopes. So Pennsylvania specifically has notoriously a lot of hoops that you have to jump through as a voter to get your absentee or mail-in ballot to count. And so you have a security envelope and a regular envelope, and the security envelope has to be signed and dated. And if you're missing the security envelope, or if you're missing your signature, the date is wrong, then they can toss it. right? Some counties, not all counties, will allow you to cure it. You are supposed to, if your vote is not counted, be able to vote provisionally on election day, right? But that's a fertile ground for litigation, and there are always lawsuits in Pennsylvania where it is Republicans, and I mean I don't think we should sugarcoat it. There are no Democrats saying don't count those votes. It is Republican lawsuits which are specifically designed to throw those out, right? That they say if you screw up your ballot, they should throw it away and you should not get a chance to fix it or vote provisionally, right? That's trying to disenfranchise people for an administrative mistake. And the courts are in two places over this, although nobody can say that it makes elections more fair to throw somebody out because their vote, their absentee ballot doesn't have a signature on it. There are other lawsuits which are a kind of placeholder for litigation that they know that it isn't going to work now. So these are other lawsuits such as the vote purge lawsuits. So they are going on in places like, Alabama, the Secretary of State enacted this vote purge, has tried to put it into effect and has been restrained by the court. And there is indeed a similar litigation ongoing in Virginia where Governor Glenn Youngkin announced a vote purge. So a vote purge is kind of based on this theory that secretaries of states are not cleaning their voter rolls. And I mean, that's kind of resting on the assumption that the voter rolls can be dirty, which is kind of a wink and a nod to this theory that there's like egregious election fraud going on. And there just isn't. No one has ever been able to prove such a thing. But that's kind of the theory, that the vote rolls are dirty with non-citizens or people who have moved or people who have died. And that, in fact, those people, if they, have moved away or died, are actively casting ballots. And that's not a thing. I believe that the Georgia Secretary of State came out this morning and said, we did a whole cleaning and we found 20 non-citizen voters in the entire state. And he didn't say that they had voted. He said that they were registered to vote, right? Like that's a marginal thing. But other states, Republicans in other states are suing to say that the vote rolls should be purged, that they should be cleaned before the election. That's not really seeking relief right now, because under the National Voter Registration Act, we are deep into the 90-day quiet period. So that means that you're not supposed to enact systemic voter roll purges or cleaning during this period right before the election, because it's not enough time for legitimate voters to fix it if it's wrong, right? So in states like, but in other states like such as Alabama, the government has gone ahead and done it and then forced the Department of Justice to sue. You can, of course, if you find somebody who is dead, take them off the voter rolls. Individual voters can be removed from the rolls, but you can't take whole classes of people and remove them. In Alabama, I mean, they've taken off people who became naturalized citizens. Usually the purges are enacted because they say, well, this person in 2020 said that they were not a citizen. Well, there's lots of people who were not citizens in 2020 who are citizens now. And in Alabama, particularly egregiously, like they have heirs, they have people who were definitely born here, and they have people who fat fingered it, right? Wrote down, clicked the wrong box, whatever, said at some point they weren't citizens, and then said, oh yeah, no, I'm totally a citizen. Like I was born in Tuscaloosa in 1957, right? Like these are bad purges. And that's why you're not supposed to do it within 90 days of the election, because voters have to go through all of these hoops to prove that they were born here and get themselves back on the rolls. And if you do it 40 days before the election, and by the way, Glenn Youngkin in Virginia, he announced it on the 90th day before the election. That wasn't an accident. That was a big middle finger.
Yeah, he knew exactly what that was. And like I've talked about on this podcast before, for listeners, go back to the episode with Tina Barton, where these infractions inside the 90-day window are also a real problem for election workers and clerks to try to get these things done, because they don't want to be outside the law either. And it also strikes me as these things, while stopping people from voting because they have to go back through the process, it also, I think, has a chilling effect on people
100%
re-registering to vote. And also, a heating effect, if this is a word we could use, for for people to be upset that the DOJ is now suing Alabama or Virginia. And it turns out voters on the other side of this thing as well. So it's sort of this three-pronged problem that they have, even though they know that these lawsuits are garbage and they are going to lose. Is that
Yes.
troubling to you as somebody who watches the courts?
Oh, it's 100% troubling. And like, look, you're a journalist. I'm a journalist. I'm on the Trump campaign's mailing list and I get, 50 emails a day.
Me too.
And
Yeah.
as soon as the Justice Department sued, the Virginia, they sent me an immediate email that said the Justice Department is trying to keep undocumented immigrants. Well, they didn't say undocumented immigrants, but they said
Right.
trying to keep illegals on the voting rolls. Like, that's not what's happened, but that's the way it's spun. And I would agree with you that it is a placeholder to make claims post-election that the voter rolls were dirty and full of undocumented immigrants. No evidence of. And I think that a lot of these lawsuits, which I would characterize as garbage lawsuits, are really press releases filed on state and federal court dockets to say, so that you can point to them and say, right, like there was one in Nevada where there was an RNC lawsuit in Nevada to force the Secretary of State to clean the voter rolls, and they said, well, there's 5,000 non-citizen voters or dirty voters on these voting rolls. Well, that's not actually correct, but they can say, look, here it is, and it's a court filing, and so it's real. And I think we shouldn't leave this, kind of pre-election shenanigans topic without talking about the individual voter challenges, which are being lodged by busybodies. I think that there are 63,000 individual challenges in Georgia alone because they enacted a law that said any, random obnoxious person can comb through the voter rolls and challenge individual voters. Now, it's not clear. The Secretary of State, Brad Raffensperger, has been really clear that he doesn't think that this is appropriate or legal, but it is a law that was enacted by the legislature. He thinks that it's kind of unconstitutional. But so there is differential enforcement, right? So in bigger counties like Fulton County, they're like, okay, we're going to deal with this, but we're not going to kick any voter off the voter rolls presumptively. Or, in some other counties where registrars might look at the, disenfranchisement as like a positive goal, they won't let you vote if you don't show up with your birth certificate or proof of residency or something at the polls. And so I think that we ought to look at this as, and we'll talk about it later, I hope, as a seed that's planted, as a placeholder for challenges to individual ballots in the post-election period, whether through litigation or through, a Bush v. Gore type challenge, right? We all remember the pictures of in Florida after the election in 2000, where there were individual ballots being challenged and scrutinized, and that these lawsuits asking for voter purges and these individual voter roll challenges or individual voter challenges are a placeholder so that if Harris is ahead, it designates a pool of votes which could be perhaps challenged.
Sure. And I do want to talk about the placeholder things, but I don't want to leave this either without talking about the current Republican attack on overseas and military ballots, because
100%.
it is something that no one has ever cared about before. It is proof that absentee voting is extremely safe and secure if we let members of the military do it and members of the diplomatic corps use it. But what are you seeing when you're watching this particular set of lawsuits?
Okay. So what you're talking about is the Uniform and Overseas Citizens Absentee Voting Act, which I think most people would just call it UOCAVA because, it's kind of a mouthful.
Yeah.
And it was enacted in 1986 to ensure that overseas and military voters could cast a ballot with what's known as the federal postcard application. So it's a little tiny actual postcard, and it says, put your social security number or your driver's license number or sign a test under penalty of perjury that you are a citizen. And it is a tiny, literally a postcard that you can mail to the registrar in your state. And it functions both as a registration to vote and as a request for an absentee ballot. Okay. And for a very long time, this was not controversial. This law has been on the books, as I said, for more than 3 decades. And it was uncontroversial because it was largely used by the military. And Republicans felt that the military was a strong voting bloc for them. That's actually less true. It's funny, I said it on the air the other day, and my son, who works for the ACLU and is really deep in this stuff, immediately emailed me and said, no, veterans skew Republican. Active duty, it's much more mixed. But the point is that when it was clear that it started to be used more by absentee voters, as it was in 2020, I think it was like 63% citizens abroad and not military. It started to kind of attract the attention of Republicans who were interested in disenfranchising. If the game is to allow fewer people to vote, and look, if you know that 6 in 10 absentee ballots are going to be citizens abroad who are much more Democratic leaning. They're almost uniformly Democratic voting. So if you kind of can designate a set of votes, a subset of votes, and you know that 60% of them are going to be Democrats, that looks like a target-rich environment for Republicans. So they've sort of filed votes particularly in 3 swing states. So in Michigan and North Carolina, the votes are seeking to cabin or diminish the number of absentee ballots from dependents, right? So I think in North Carolina, the issue is that North Carolina allows spouses of citizens who could have voted in North Carolina and who live overseas, even if you weren't registered, or dependents, even if you never lived in North Carolina, you can register, you can vote in North Carolina. And so these lawsuits in North Carolina and Michigan are aimed at kind of diminishing the number of people who can access the UOCAVA ballot in those states. Pennsylvania is a whole nother crazy town. What they want to do, it's a lawsuit that's filed by 6 Republican Pennsylvania congressmen. I think the named defendant is Guy Reschenthaler, and also it's Scott Perry, who was big in the Stop the Steal moment. In fact, if you're deep up in the lore, he was the one who recommended Jeff Clark to be the attorney general and militarize or weaponize the Justice Department to claim that there was fraud when there wasn't.
It was also Perry and Clark who were working together sort of behind the scenes and calling members of state legislatures to not certify the election. And then I don't think it was Perry's direct idea, but like he was a part of the nascent stage of that idea to have the fake slates of electors in all those swing states. I think that was Perry. Yes.
He's in trouble, right? Right. He's got a really strong challenger. His district is not as Republican as it used to be. He's got a very strong challenger named Janelle Stelson. So, he's worried, but he's also kind of been involved in the Stop the Steal moment. In fact, his phone was seized by the feds at one point during this investigation. So Reschenthaler is the named defendant in this lawsuit. And this lawsuit seeks to have all of the absentee ballots in the entire state cabined. And, because they think that they should, that they don't comply. It's a really silly legal theory. They say that it doesn't comply with the Help America Vote Act or that it violates the NVRA. It's nonsense. Like the law says what it says. And it violates the actual literal language of the federal postcard application law. It's a nonsense lawsuit.
We're looking at an election that might be as close as it gets. I mean, it already feels that way. I mean, so those point shavings, and I talk about this a lot on the show, is that we are talking in half points, quarter points in states. We are talking about in 2020, 40,000 votes in places like Georgia and Arizona, 150,000 votes in Michigan. So it's not that many votes when it comes down to these things. And so being able to have these things holding their spots to shave off these points is what could change the face of this election.
I would agree with that. And I think there are other plans kind of clearly in place to file look, it didn't work last time. And there's a reason it didn't work last time. And mostly it was that it was inexpertly executed, right? So, they always talk about the 60, or I think it's 65 lawsuits that Trump and his allies filed, and they all failed. I mean, there was like maybe a half a victory because and that was to do with like whether observers could observe the count, how far away they had to stand during COVID, during, that wasn't a real victory, and it didn't make any difference. But I think that we are going to see more of these chaos lawsuits filed in the wake of the election. There'll be, crazy lawsuits like the Pennsylvania lawsuit by those congressmen is frankly, I would call a crazy lawsuit.
Sure.
I think that they're sort of in the purpose of them is not to win. The purpose is to kind of delay certification. And as you said, flood the zone with nonsense, right? Mm-hmm. Because people are going to look at the lawsuits and they're going to say, well, there's all of this suggestion that there was fraud or shenanigans, or there's that the lawsuits mainly ask those state courts or federal courts to jump in and delay certification of the vote to kind of check or verify some cockamamie theory about whatever.
Sure. We're starting to run out of time here, and I don't want to keep you too long because I've already kept you longer than I said I was going to talk to you. But let's lead with a little bit of optimism here. So It seems that Republicans, yes, are better prepared this time around, but so are Democrats. Although you sort of squinted there. So are Republicans not better prepared this time around?
Well, I think that they are better staffed up. But I also think they there isn't any vote fraud, right? They haven't proved the vote fraud. They had 4 years to find it. And I think in some sense, the public has become inured to the narrative, right? Like the true believers are going to believe it. But I think I think that they are certainly better staffed up, but also it's sort of played out. They already ran this play the one time. We on the Democratic side, I know you're not that, but I am on the Democratic side, and I'm a lawyer. And I think that Democrats are significantly better prepared this time.
Liz, this was such a pleasure. Thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right, now it's time for TLTO, or Too Long Tuned Out, where I tell you just the stuff you need to know from the stuff you just heard. There is a massive effort at play right now in the 2024 election to litigate it in the courts before voters have even gone to the ballot boxes on Election Day. Most of the 165 cases have been about how states have tracked voter records and who can and can't vote, and those cases were mostly brought by Republicans, while Democrats have sued states hoping to stop those things from happening. Most of these cases are also really only playing out in the 7 swing states. Most of these cases are also playing out in just the 7 swing states, which should also tell you a little bit about how serious the people bringing them are about these problems. Otherwise, they'd be suing over these things in every state. A lot of these cases, again brought by the GOP, are mostly meant to sow doubt in election integrity under the guise of trying to better it, even though our elections are as secure as they have ever been. And a lot of these cases are placeholders for future lawsuits after the election, specifically if Kamala Harris wins. Okay, that is it for today's show. I want to thank Liz Dye again for coming on. And if you're interested in any more of her work, hearing her talk about these things or reading what she's writing about it, and you really should be, I've got links to all that in the show notes on this episode. Please rate and review this show on whatever podcast app you're listening to it on. It really helps push it up in the podcast algorithms. I don't really know how it works. I just know that it does work. Speaking of that, you can also like, subscribe, and hit that bell for notifications on YouTube. It also helps spread the word there, and you won't miss out on any episodes either. You can also subscribe to the Make It Make Sense Substack. It's just $5 a month. I've got extra content there, including extended interviews with all of my guests. And as always, share the show on social media. It's Mims News Pod. That's MIMS News Pod. It's all one word on every platform. I am at Grant Herms on X and at Grant Herms TV on everything else. Thank you so much for listening today. I'm Grant Herms, and I'll be back with another Mims Mini tomorrow.